Brisket rebounds by Soul Oliver aka Solo BN. Half a club sandwich. Some leftover macaroni salad. Aha! A nearly unopened package of Pop-Tarts. This is what had become of Skip Davis just 2 years out of school, homeless and grateful to find discarded food that hadn't been slobbered on. Although he was aware of the shame of the situation as he wolfed down his found supper, he stowed the feeling away with the rest of the baggage he'd sift through later when times were better. If they ever were. While he'd gone through all of the hoops of education, he hadn't done so with any zeal. Still, on the day that he stood in his cap and gown holding a freshly minted graduation certificate from the East Elmhurst Tech School of Robotics, he could never have dreamed that one day his daily dining companions would be rodents. Shoo! He shouted at a cold-eyed rat who was coveting his prized Pop-Tarts. Satisfied that he'd defended his dessert, Skip began trolling through the fresh rubbish heap for a tasty beverage to wash down his feast. As his hands picked through the piles, a metallic gleam caught his eye from further down valley, near the dilapidated fire escape that was the entry point to his makeshift home. Skip made his way towards the prize. Maybe it was a leftover beer keg, that would be a find. But as he neared the object, he saw that the metal area wasn't nearly so large. In fact, it was just a patch of metal showing through a leg. "Hello," he said, eyes going wide. He tried to control his excitement as he dug into the rubbish around the leg. He'd run across discarded android parts before, but he had a feeling about this time the metal looked freshly exposed. Holy Mother of God! Skip smacked himself in the face. Yep, he wasn't dreaming. Laying in a heap before him was a late model Candrix android, and a real beauty at that. Through what looked like a tattered cocktail waitress getup, Skip could see that she was finely sculpted if a bit mangled in spots. Generous breasts. Well-formed thighs. An angelic face crowned by brambles of golden hair. "Hey!" he shouted down at the damaged beauty. "Are you functional?" But the droid was little more than a dead mannequin, limbs twisted in unnatural directions and a good chunk of her right side damaged or missing. "Come on, then," he said, bending down and hoisting the droid over his shoulder. "Ship, she was heavy. Let's see if I can make myself a little playmate out of you." It took every ounce of energy his skinny body had, but Skip managed to get the android up to his second-floor loft, which is what he called the abandoned office floor he called home. With one final heave he landed her in his makeshift cot. Looking down on her, for the first time in his life, Skip felt like he had a purpose. He passed his hand tenderly over the droid's scraped forehead. "Don't worry," he said, not allowing himself to feel foolish. "I'm going to take good care of you." And he meant it. This is where he would make his stand and prove his worth to himself and the world. He didn't care that part of her head was missing, or that he didn't have a single tool to work with. He would resurrect her, and she would be his living resume. And he was sure she'd be much more than that. But right now the sun was setting, his body ached from the effort of hauling in his prize, and his belly was full. Skip laid down next to the buxom robot, rested her head on his shoulder, and fell fast asleep. Dreams blended together. Jagged little scenes starting abruptly and ending too soon. Repeating. Blistering white sensations, unnameable and feral. A woman's face. A man's expressions of orgasmic pleasure. Eyes squinted closed in pain. Unfathomable hunger. Inside. Must put myself inside. Make you mine. Bend to my will. Again. Thrust again. Hold you down. Inside. Make you mine. A woman's face. Can't break free. Something else. Missing. Replaced by cool, fresh air. Jagged little scenes. Unfathomable hunger. Thrust again. Ending too soon. Jagged make you mine. The man's eyes squinted. Put myself inside. Thrust again. Blended together. Repeating. Make you blistering white sensations. Jagged fetal pleasure. Inside. Bend. Thrust again. Abruptly mine. Cool, fresh air. Break free. Skip awoke with a start, surprised by the face directly in front of his. The beautiful face, staring into infinity. Just as it did when he fell asleep. "You scared the shit out of me," he said to the blonde-headed woman as he smoothed her hair. "Don't sneak up on me like that again." Most days, Skip would spend the first few waking hours curled up in a ball until his hunger became too great. But this was not most days. He had a purpose, and with his goal in mind, he kissed the battered android on the forehead and set off on his first mission. It was amazing what could be achieved when one had a goal. By the end of the week, Skip had assembled in his loft most of what he needed to conduct rudimentary android maintenance and repair. Perfectly good gauges, tools, and parts were thrown out every day. Newer wasn't always better, and Skip was glad that not everyone believed that. Of course, his android's needs would be more than rudimentary. He'd left her on the coat the whole time he hunted for his tools, not wanting to start his project before all of the pieces were assembled. But now that he'd found a working portable generator, he could at least conduct the diagnosis. "Let's start with that head of yours," he said, rolling the droid onto her side. Skip's eyes couldn't help falling down to her ass, which was half exposed. He looked away before his hard-on completely set in. There was work to be done. Until his work was done, there would be no ass. Skip refocused on her head. Ugly, but not as bad as he feared. A chunk was certainly missing, but it was a piece that he knew from his studies was not critical to her basic operation. Touching the meter to several wires, plates, and regions, his heart leapt. Low levels of power still coursed through most of her brain, but not through most of her body. At each point along her scraped and battered right side he touched the probe. Dead. So that must mean that her power core in her torso was still linked to her head. How could that be? In theory, power radiated throughout the body, with signals from the brain directing its flow. Unless it was some kind of emergency shutdown. Skip looked at the droid's wounded head again. "Go home," he said, examining the hole. He could now see that the chunk missing must have been some sort of module inserted into an otherwise normal artificial matrix brain. A third component had been wedged between two parts that usually joined directly together. So if he could just wire up the parts like they were supposed to be. Skip was amazed by how much he remembered from his classes, and worked with every ounce of his concentration to mend the damage. It was well into the night when he came to what he thought was the last connection. Skip paused, preparing for elation or massive disappointment. He'd take any reaction at all. Even powering up a droid as damaged as this one would be a major achievement, especially given what he had to work with. "Here it goes," he said, soldering the last connection. Nothing. Wait. A low hum from somewhere within the droid. "Are you functional?" he said, scared now that she would answer. She was still on her side, facing away from him. If he could just see her eyes, fearful of moving her lest the delicate work he'd just completed should shake apart, Skip slowly stood up and arched his head up over the droid's body. The curve of her cheek came into view. Skip glanced at her chest. No sign of breathing. Eyes almost visible. "A-A-A-A-A-A-A-A-H!" shrieked the robot, eyes focusing up at the ceiling, mouth open wide. Skip jumped back and began running in a circle, stunned. The android spasmed and twitched, arms, head, and legs moving in unnatural ways. "Stop it! Stop it!" yelled Skip. "Shut down! Shut down!" Now he stood over the droid, whose eyes were wide open, sweeping around the room with a look of horror. Her face twitched uncontrollably, and the sounds coming from her were unearthly. Skip pinned her down by the shoulders and looked into her eyes. "Look at me!" he yelled, and to his surprise, her eyes fixed onto his face. Her body still bucked and twitched, but she was conscious. "If you don't shut down, you're going to shake what's left of you apart." For a moment the body calmed, but just as Skip was about to move off of her, it began spasming wildly. It seemed to rise straight up, knocking him back onto the floor. "Oof," he said as he landed face down on the grimy carpet, saying it once again as the droid's weight flopped down on top of him and slid off. And she was still once more. "Damn it!" he shouted, turning his head to see the droid looking back at him. But her face was frozen in an expression of surprise. Most of her weight was still against him, so it was with some effort that Skip rolled onto his side to face her fully. Her arm slid limp and lifeless away, and Skip swung his arm around so that he could cradle her head in his hand. Tears began to form in his eyes. It was as if the whole world was looking down at him, pointing and laughing. He'd always told himself that if he'd really tried, he could make something of himself. This was his real final exam. And he had failed. Why couldn't you just live? Tears coursing down Skip's cheeks. Look at me, he said to himself. Broken up and crying over a goddamn robot. He looked into the beautiful robot's dead eyes and rage began to well up inside him. Rage and frustration. Skip's eyes wandered down to look the droid's tits, and an image of her as flashed into his mind. Up to this point he hadn't even taken the droid's dress off. It would make the moment even more exciting when she was operational and ready to please the man who'd saved her. But he hadn't saved her. She wouldn't lie. She hadn't tried hard enough. Without thinking about what he was doing, Skip found himself moving himself on top of the android. No more Mr. Nice Guy. Skip tore open the blouse he'd mended days earlier and drooled at the sight of her breasts. I'm going to fuck you every which way. Skip quickly shed his grimy pants, his cock springing up. Scooting himself up, he placed his penis between the android's breasts. They felt warm. Up, said the blonde droid. Skip's heart leapt. If she was functional and her breasts were warm, what else might be ready for him? His level of urgency was quickly becoming painful. Brisket's head swam. She felt a man on top of her but couldn't remember a thing. The man's penis was out. And hard. And between her tits. Although she didn't recall much, a sense of rage began to fill her. Hands were tearing at her dress. Sorry to be so forward, but you owe me, said the man as he reached down to get his first feel of her. Brisket watched the man's eyes grow wide as she felt his hand land in her crotch. Skip's stomach turned over as he felt something warm, thick, and long where the android's cunt should have been. Damn it. Looking at the droid's face, it seemed like she was sneering at him. Skip slid his hand under the droid's rather large testicles and pushed his finger back, searching until it found a target. Well, at least you have an asshole, he said, pulling his hand out before quickly rolling her onto her stomach. So do you, growled Brisket as she felt the man's meaty penis against her crack. It happened too quickly for Skip's mind to process. One moment he was getting ready to find hot release, the next he was flying backwards from the android. Landing on his ass with his back to a wall, shaken, Skip opened his eyes just in time to see the android close in on him, cock swinging. You read ... alive. The thrill of accomplishment Skip felt momentarily made him forget his predicament, and he stood up. Brisket froze, confused by the man's behavior. Didn't he realize that she was going to have her way with him? But the man's face held no fear, only joy. Unable to help himself, Skip threw his arms around the well-endowed android. You're alive. I saved you. Tears of joy fell from his eyes onto the android's shoulder. Understanding began to dawn on Brisket, and she was beginning to remember what had happened to her. So ... you must have found me. And you fixed me. Yes. That was stupid of you. What? Belly to belly with the android woman, Skip felt that her penis inflate against him. Even as he released his embrace, he felt the android's arm reach around his waist. Her hand patted his ass cheek. Sorry if I seem ungrateful, said Brisket as she felt along the man's crack. But I need to make sure I'm still functioning properly. No. This isn't right. The man's squirming only heightened Brisket's appetite, and precum began to dribble from her head. You know you can't get away. Still the man struggled. Do you feel my penis there? Brisket slid her cock up and down the man's belly as she stood against him. Do you? Yes, said Skip, who was losing the energy to struggle. Well, it's going to be all the way inside you in 10 seconds. 1. Skip tried to push off from the android, coiling his legs and springing upward. But the droid was too strong. ... The effort took away most of the strength he had left. and it was only the droid's arm around him that kept him standing. 3. He felt his body spun around, and then he was face to face with a grimy wall. 4. A warm body pressed against his back, hard nipples scraping at his skin. 5. A greasy, thick finger poked between his half cheeks. 6. Slender but strong arms reached around to hold him under his arms. The robot woman's spongy hard head spit up lubricant onto him and mashed itself forward. SCBN. Searing pain as the woman entered his body, hot fluid lubricating her cock's path forward. 8. Nearly passing out, it felt like his insides would soon be punched up through his mouth. Still the intruder slid inward. 9. A hand grabbed at his breast. He felt a nip at his neck and then a thrust. 10. The universe swam in Skip's head, and he felt he'd been impaled by a pitchfork. There were sounds and smells and most of all feelings, but which were which he could not tell. And then a strange calm began to take over, much like a jetliner setting into smooth skies after a rough takeoff. There was certainly the pressure of the droid's penis inside him, but a pleasurable sensation had begun to buzz in his gut as well. "What's your name?" asked the female android whose cock impaled him. "SK. Skip. Well, Skip, you've already met my penis," said the droid, adjusting her stance and sending chills and shocks throughout his body. "My name is Brisket, and I'm a little pissed off right now. Especially at humans." Brisket pressed her body into the man, sending his face flat against the wall. In a quick motion she slipped her cock part way out and slid it back in again. The man winced and moaned. Brisket's mind tingled, but not just from the physical pleasure. Something was different in her brain. Something was missing. Something that had always held her back. "If I were to unleash my full desire on you right now, I don't believe you'd survive," continued Brisket, gyrating her hips. "But I do believe that if you hadn't found me, I wouldn't be alive right now. Ironic, isn't it? You can just nod." Skip nodded that he agreed that it was an odd twist that led him to be but fucked by the android he'd been hoping to make into his love companion. Tall and curvy, pretty-faced and blonde. And now she would be emptying her balls inside him, and possibly worse. Much worse. Skip realized that his brain surgery must have taken out part of the controls that prevented androids from opting too autonomously. Keeping them from harming humans. Keeping them from killing you, said Brisket, stroking the man's hair, passing her hand down his cheek, and letting it rest in a light grip on his neck. "I believe I could kill you." Skip's heart pounded. As low as he'd sunk, he didn't want to die like this. Strangled or neck snapped by a blonde Amazon with her dick up his ass. Would she then fuck his cooling corpse? But Brisket's hand slid down and down and down ... and closed around his own cock. "I'll tell you what," said the droid, stroking him to full hardness. "If I come first, I won't touch you again." Skip felt Brisket's hips pulled back and her penis followed, sending a variation of the new pleasure through him. Inward it glided again, and Skip had to concentrate not to release. "Now, if you come before I do." Brisket's hand gave him a few tugs. Then I won't make the same promise. Not if you understand." Before Skip could finish his first nod, Brisket's cock began to drive in and out of him, the air from his lungs expelling as the force of the android's body pushed him against the wall. Brisket felt brand new as she slipped herself in and out of the man. So this puny man fixed her. "Who the fuck do you think you are?" shouted Brisket, pistoning her thick meat into him. "So you were going to fuck me? A little shit like you. Well, this poor little helpless girl doesn't need your help." Brisket pushed herself all the way inside the man and then forced him down onto the ground with her. Now Brisket lay on top of him, and she began her assault once more. Visions of her life as she knew it came flooding through her. The first time she'd met her owners ... the way she'd taken control of them ... her plans for immortality ... the setup that led to jump through a skyscraper window. shouted Brisket, suddenly realizing that her plans were in danger. Brisket looked down at the body that was receiving her, vanquished and helpless to do anything but feel the pain and pleasure she chose for him. Her penis deep inside ... One final insult, to fill him with her fluid and leave him sticky, empty and confused. Like a blinding flash the feeling washed through her, and Brisket emptied herself into the human as her cock spasmed. A mix of fluids welled out of him as she abstracted herself, and her penis swung low as she crouched down and rolled the man over. His eyes were rolled back, though he was breathing. Looking at his crotch, she saw that he had climaxed. Brisket squatted down over Skip's face, letting her balls and cock roll along his face. Skip was barely conscious. All he knew was that he was still alive. In pain and grappling with the loss of a strange pleasure, but alive. Looking up through Brisket's endowment, Skip could see that the droid would be leaving him. "Lucky for you, there's no telling who came first," said Brisket, who honestly wasn't sure whether or not the man would have lived to tell the story had she not remembered that she had places to be. And although gratitude wasn't a normal part of the android's thinking, she had an idea of how she would one day thank the man that put her back together again.